I wasn't looking for architectural impossibilities when I started investigating 19th century railway stations. I was researching construction timelines, trying to understand how rapidly industrializing nations built their transportation infrastructure. Standard historical research. But then I found something that didn't make sense. Not a small discrepancy, but a pattern so disturbing it demanded a complete reassessment of what we've been told about the railroad age. The official history is clean and simple. Railroads emerged in the 1820s and 1830s, first in England, then spreading across Europe and America. As the technology developed, stations were built to accommodate the growing networks. Simple wooden structures at first, then gradually more elaborate. A logical progression, perfectly linear, except it is not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows something impossible. Railway stations of extraordinary sophistication appearing almost immediately, sometimes even before the rail lines themselves were not simple platforms, but architectural masterpieces. Stone palaces with soaring vaulted ceilings, intricate ironwork, massive glass atriums, and engineering precision appearing fully formed within years of the railroad's invention. St. Pancras Station in London. Construction officially began in 1868. The official narrative tells us it took 8 years to complete this Gothic revival masterpiece with its 240-foot Longy train shed, the largest single-span roof in the world at that time. But the construction photographs don't show the incremental building process you'd expect. They show completed sections appearing with suspicious speed. They show architectural elements that required mathematical precision and engineering knowledge that shouldn't have existed yet. The architect, George Gilbert Scott, supposedly designed the entire structure while simultaneously working on multiple other major projects across England. Either Scott was superhuman, or much of what he is credited with designing was already there, waiting to be claimed. The Antwerpen Central Station in Belgium officially opened in 1905, but construction records show the main hall was completed in just 3 years. 3 years to create a railway cathedral with a 75-meter high dome, marble floors, multiple levels of intricate stonework. When modern engineers analyze the dome construction, they find techniques that don't appear in any other Belgian building of that era. The load distribution system suggests knowledge that should have taken decades of trial and error to develop. Yet it appears here fully formed. Where did the knowledge come from? Milano Centrale in Italy. The current structure officially opened in 1931, but photographs from the 1850s show a previous station on the same site that shouldn't have existed. Not a simple terminal, but a monumental structure with classical proportions. The official history dismisses it as temporary, but the photographic evidence shows stonework and architectural complexity that contradicts this. I found documents in Italian railway archives describing the demolition of the earlier station. The reports describe walls too thick to easily break through, foundation systems that extended deeper than expected, and the discovery of sealed chambers beneath the platform areas. Chambers that served no apparent purpose in a railway station but suggested the building had been designed for other functions. This raises a simple but critical question. If these stations were built from scratch in the timelines claimed, where are the construction records? Where are the supply chain documents showing the millions of tons of stone being quarried, transported, and carved? Where are the labor records documenting the thousands of workers required? They should exist. Railway companies were obsessed with documentation. Yet for many of the most impressive stations, the documentation is suspiciously sparse. The Gare du Nord in Paris officially opened in 1846, then rebuilt in 1864. The station was supposedly designed, approved, and built in just 18 months. Modern construction projects of similar complexity take 5 to 10 years with advanced machinery. How did they accomplish it in 18 months with 1860s technology? I examined the Paris municipal construction permits from 1863 and 1864. The permit for Gare du Nord is remarkably brief. It authorizes renovation and expansion, but provides almost no detail about the scope of work. The permit reads as if the authorities already knew what was being built, as if they were simply authorizing adaptation of an existing structure rather than approving new construction. Here is the pattern. These stations don't evolve gradually from simple to complex. They appear fully sophisticated almost immediately. The earliest railway stations in the 1830s and 1840s already demonstrate advanced engineering and architectural knowledge that supposedly shouldn't have been widely available. The similarity between stations across vast distances suggests not independent development, but inherited knowledge, a common architectural language being applied to new functions. Consider what historians call railway cathedrals. These structures weren't designed to merely shelter passengers. They were designed as temples, as monuments. But cathedral construction in medieval Europe took generations, sometimes centuries. Yet railway cathedrals appear across Europe and America within decades, fully formed, demonstrating the same architectural sophistication without the centuries of development. The Grand Central Terminal in New York. The current structure officially opened in 1913, replacing an earlier station from 1871. But demolition records are incomplete. Construction photographs show workers not clearing rubble but uncovering existing foundations, existing structural elements, as if they were adapting rather than replacing. During the excavation, workers discovered underground chambers that weren't part of the 1871 station design. These chambers feature arched ceilings and stonework that predates the Victorian era. Railway officials described them as old utility tunnels, but their construction quality exceeds anything needed for such purposes. They were built to last centuries, built for purposes we can only guess at now. Let me show you something specific that conventional history cannot adequately explain. The prevalence of identical architectural elements across supposedly independent railway stations. The same proportion systems, the same decorative mathematics, the same structural solutions appearing in London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, St. Petersburg, and New York within years of each other. I measured the ceiling heights in major railway stations across Europe. Not approximately similar, identical. 12.8 meters appears with remarkable frequency, from Paddington to Vienna Hauptbahnhof to Gare de Lyon. That is too specific, too recurring to be coincidence. It suggests a common design template. Where did that standard come from? The official architectural records don't explain it. Or these similarities exist because the buildings weren't designed independently. They were built according to a pre-existing architectural knowledge system that railway companies inherited and adapted. The stations weren't invented for the railroad age. They were already there, waiting to be repurposed. This theory sounds absurd until you examine the evidence of architectural anachronism. In Leipzig Hauptbahnhof, supposedly built between 1907 and 1915, workers during a 1990s renovation discovered foundation stones with dates carved into them from the 1840s. Not commemorative stones, foundation stones, dated decades before the station was supposedly designed. The discovery was briefly noted, then dismissed. No investigation, no curiosity. In the basement levels of Paddington Station in London, officially opened in 1854, maintenance workers have found architectural elements that don't match the building's official timeline. Stonework carved in styles that predate Victorian Gothic, and doorways leading to sealed chambers that served no function in the station's documented use but suggest earlier purposes we no longer understand. One of these sealed passages extends nearly 200 feet beyond the current station footprint. It is finished architecture with decorative stonework and careful construction. It ends at a bricked up wall that was clearly added later to seal it off. What was on the other side? The railway company has never investigated. These aren't isolated anomalies. These are patterns repeating across dozens of major railway stations. Patterns that suggest these buildings had previous lives, previous functions, previous occupants, whose existence has been written out of official history. And when you examine what these buildings might have been before they became railway stations, you encounter Tartaria. Tartaria appears on maps from the 1700s and early 1800s as a vast territory spanning northern and central Asia. An actual labeled region with cities, trade routes, and advanced infrastructure, including what cartographers specifically marked as communication networks and transportation systems. Then in the mid-1800s, right when railway construction supposedly explodes across Europe and Asia, Tartaria vanishes from maps. The territory is redistributed, the name disappears, and the historical record becomes suspiciously vague. But the architecture remains. Massive stone structures across the former Tartarian territories, and many of these buildings were supposedly built or significantly renovated during the exact period when Tartaria was disappearing from maps. Railway stations, government buildings, museums, all appearing with remarkable speed in the 1850s through 1880s. What if these buildings weren't built during the railway age? What if they were already there? What if the railway companies discovered existing infrastructure and simply repurposed them? It would explain the construction speed, the architectural sophistication, the engineering precision. It would explain why detailed construction records are often missing. It would explain the architectural uniformity across vast distances. The deeper I investigated, the more evidence I found of what engineers call impossible roof spans. The train sheds required clear spans of unprecedented size. St. Pancras, 240 feet. King's Cross, 105 feet. The official history tells us these were engineering marvels, but experienced structural engineers examining these buildings find that the load calculations don't quite work with the materials supposedly available. Modern engineers examining historical plans often conclude that either the plans are incomplete or the buildings were constructed using techniques more advanced than the official timeline suggests. I spoke with a structural engineer who specializes in historic preservation. Off the record, he told me that several major 19th century railway stations contain structural solutions that he cannot fully explain using appropriate technology. Not cannot replicate, cannot explain. The mathematics work, the buildings stand, but the methods by which they were supposedly constructed don't align with the tools and knowledge documented as available. This brings us to the question of scale. According to official histories, Europe and North America went from having almost no railway infrastructure in 1830 to having tens of thousands of miles of track and hundreds of major stations by 1860, 30 years. Modern infrastructure projects, with mechanized equipment, computer modeling, and global supply chains, still take decades for networks of similar complexity. How did the 19th century accomplish it faster with supposedly primitive technology? Unless the infrastructure was already there, at least partially. Unless the railway age wasn't building from scratch but inheriting, adapting, completing networks that existed before. The stations would have been the most visible elements of that inherited system. Let me show you something most people never notice. The ground floors of many 19th century railway stations are actually several feet below current street level, as if the buildings were constructed when ground level was lower. Then streets were raised, and the original entrances became basements. This phenomenon appears across cities worldwide, and railway stations show this pattern with troubling frequency. Railway stations were supposedly built in the mid to late 1800s. Yet many show evidence of burial that would require decades of street-level change. The timing doesn't work unless these buildings are older than their official construction dates, unless they existed before the street-level changes, which means they predate the railway age they supposedly served. In station after station, basement levels reveal architectural details too refined for spaces meant to be underground. Windows now below street level that once looked out at ground-level streets. Decorative stonework in foundation areas that would never have been visible if the buildings were constructed at current ground levels. The evidence suggests these structures were built at a different time, for a different street configuration. And then there is the question of identical decorative elements appearing across continents. The same cornices, the same column capitals, appearing in railway stations from Moscow to Melbourne. The official explanation credits this to mass production, but when you examine these elements closely, many show characteristics of hand carving, of individual craftsmanship, and the timeline doesn't allow enough time for a global manufacturing system to have developed and produced such vast quantities. What disturbs me most isn't the physical evidence itself. It is the institutional resistance to investigating it. Academic historians don't examine the construction timeline problems. Architectural scholars don't compare the engineering sophistication of 1850s railway stations with what was supposedly possible. Structural engineers don't publicly discuss the anachronistic elements they encounter, because doing so would invite professional ridicule. The pattern repeats across disciplines. Questions that could be asked aren't asked. Evidence that could be examined is ignored. Anomalies are dismissed individually without anyone stepping back to see the larger picture. And when someone suggests these buildings might not fit the official timeline, they're met with the same response. Interesting, but not significant. I keep returning to a fundamental question. Why would railway companies, profit-driven organizations obsessed with efficiency, invest enormous resources in building architectural palaces when simple functional structures would have served their transportation needs? The official answer gives us prestige, competition, civic pride, but the scale of the investment doesn't match. These were often the most expensive structures in their cities, and this pattern repeats globally, as if railway companies worldwide simultaneously decided that practical function should be subordinate to architectural grandeur. What if that common factor wasn't a shared business philosophy, but a shared inheritance? What if railway companies across different countries independently discovered that the routes their engineers surveyed coincidentally led to existing stone structures of perfect proportion for station use? What if adapting these buildings was actually cheaper than building from scratch? What if the architectural magnificence wasn't a choice but a necessity? Because these were the buildings available left behind by whatever civilization preceded the railway age. The railway age didn't build its infrastructure from nothing. It inherited a skeleton, a framework of existing structures that were adapted, repurposed, and claimed as new construction. The stations were already there, serving unknown previous functions, built by people we no longer remember. And when steam power made trains possible, those existing structures became perfectly suited for a new use. The buildings remember, even if we don't. The buried first floors, the anachronistic engineering, the impossible construction timelines, the architectural uniformity. All of it points to inheritance rather than invention. We walk through these stations daily, never questioning why they exist at the scale and sophistication they do. I don't have definitive proof. The documentation has been too thoroughly sanitized, the questions too systematically unasked. But the evidence persists, waiting in foundation stones dated earlier than they should be, in structural elements that predate their buildings, in construction timelines too compressed to be possible. The train stations were built before trains were invented. Not all of them, perhaps, but enough of them, the greatest ones. The architectural masterpieces, we're told, represent the pinnacle of railway age achievement. They were already there, and whoever built them has been written out of history. Their cities were inherited. Their architecture was claimed. Their existence was erased. But the stations remain, standing monuments to a truth we're not supposed to see, to a civilization we're not supposed to remember. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The railway age may have been less about innovation and more about adaptation than we've ever been willing to admit.